When someone is missing, the people who love them do everything they can. They print flyers, they walk the streets calling out names. They sit in search command centers drinking cold coffee and staring at maps. They go on television and beg strangers to help. And almost always, the husband or the boyfriend or the father is right there in the middle of all of it, grieving loudly, cooperating fully, looking exactly like someone who needs their person found. The 10 cases in this video involve killers who understood that. Some of them stood at podiums, making tearful pleas for their missing wives. Some distributed reward posters for boys they had already buried. Some sat across from detectives, answered every question calmly, and gave investigators just enough to keep them pointed in the wrong direction. One negotiated the terms of his own cooperation in open court, and then spent 2 decades deciding, on his own schedule, what he was willing to give up. These are their stories. Case 1. Scott Peterson. Scott Lee Peterson was a 30-year-old fertilizer salesman living in Modesto, California, with his wife Lacey Denise Peterson, who was 27 years old and 7.5 months pregnant with their first child when she disappeared on Christmas Eve, 2002. They had already chosen a name for their son, Connor. Scott told police he had been out fishing alone that morning at the Berkeley Marina, roughly 90 miles from their home in Modesto. He said he came back that afternoon to find the house empty, the couple's golden retriever Mackenzie wandering alone in the backyard with its leash still attached. Lacey's stepfather, Ron Gransky, and Scott both filed missing persons reports with police that same evening. Within hours, the story was on local news. Within days, it was on every major network in the country. Modesto became the center of one of the biggest public searches in California history, with over 1,500 volunteers distributing flyers, staffing phone lines, and searching parks and neighborhoods. A reward fund was set up that eventually climbed to $500,000. A command center was established at a hotel in Modesto to coordinate tips, and the husband, Scott Peterson, was right there alongside the search effort, standing at the command center, handing out leaflets to volunteers on January 19, 2003. Lacey was already dead. She had been dead since the morning he drove away. Scott and Lacey met at California Polytechnic State University in the mid-1990s. He was studying agricultural business. They began dating and married in 1997. After college, they ran a small restaurant together in San Luis Obispo before relocating to Modesto in 2000, where Scott took a sales job with Trade Corp USA, a fertilizer company, earning $5,000 a month. They bought a 3-bedroom home on Covenant Avenue for $177,000. Lacey worked part-time as a substitute teacher and devoted herself to the home. Her family described her as someone who loved cooking, hosting dinner parties, and watching Martha Stewart. In the summer of 2002, Lacey found out she was pregnant. Her due date was February 10, 2003. To the people around them, they looked like a couple that had everything on track. The house, the careers, the baby on the way. Lacey's family, including her mother Sharon Rocha and her brother Brent, described her as happy and excited about becoming a mother. What none of them knew was that Scott had started an affair in November 2002, a month before Lacey vanished. Through a mutual friend, Scott met Amber Fry, a massage therapist from Fresno, on November 20, 2002. He told her he was not married. He told her he was free. By December 9th, 15 days before Lacey disappeared, Scott told Amber that he had lost his wife and that the coming Christmas holidays would be his first without her. Lacey was still alive when he said that. She was at home, pregnant, making plans for their son's nursery. Investigators later pointed to that December 9th conversation as the moment Scott's plan began to take shape. That same day, he paid $1,400 in cash for a 14-foot aluminium fishing boat he had been researching online. He told no one about the purchase, not his friends, not his father, who was an avid fisherman his whole life. He also began researching tidal currents in San Francisco Bay on his computer in the days that followed. On December 20th, he purchased a 2-day fishing license valid for December 23rd and 24th. On December 23rd, he had his hair cut by Lacey's sister Amy and mentioned he was planning to play golf the next day. He told several other people the same thing: golf, Christmas Eve. Prosecutors argued nothing about his behaviour suggested a man planning a spontaneous fishing trip on one of the coldest mornings of the year. On the evening of December 23rd, Lacey spoke to her mother Sharon by phone around 8:30 p.m. That was the last time Sharon ever heard her daughter's voice. The next morning, Scott later told police he last saw Lacey at around 9:30 a.m. She was watching a Martha Stewart segment about meringue and planning to mop the floors, bake cookies, and take Mackenzie for a walk in a nearby park. He left for the marina. Prosecutors told the jury he never left Lacey alive. Their theory was that Scott strangled her in their home and loaded her body into his truck before driving to the marina, where he dumped her into the bay from his boat, using homemade concrete anchors to weigh her down. When Scott returned home that afternoon and discovered Lacey was missing, he called his mother-in-law Sharon and asked if Lacey was with her. Sharon said no. That call was how she learned her daughter was gone. Scott and Ron Gransky filed police reports that evening. Detectives Alan Brocchini and John Bueller responded to the Peterson home and interviewed Scott within hours. Both detectives later said they were struck by his demeanour from the very first meeting. Bueller told ABC News he was thrown off by Scott's calm, cool manner and his lack of urgency. He never asked for a detective's card, never asked what they were doing to find her, never pushed for updates the way a terrified husband would. Brocchini described Scott's manner as a strange combination of polite and arrogant, distant and irritable, like a man who was inconvenienced rather than destroyed. Despite the growing suspicion from investigators, the public search continued. Scott participated in it. He stood at the volunteer command centre and handed out leaflets. He attended early vigils. But his behaviour kept fracturing the image he was trying to project. On New Year's Eve, the town of Modesto held a public candlelight vigil for Lacey. Hundreds of people gathered. Scott showed up. He was photographed bending down to set a candle alongside his niece, smiling. In another photo taken that night, he was standing with a group of people, laughing. While standing at that vigil, he called Amber Fry. He told her he was watching fireworks in Paris. He was in Modesto at a candlelight vigil for his missing pregnant wife, lying to his girlfriend about being in France. Amber Fry had already contacted police on December 30th after seeing news coverage of Lacey's disappearance and realising her boyfriend was Lacey's husband. She agreed to record every phone call she had with Scott going forward. Over the months that followed, police collected more than 29 hours of recorded conversations between them. Scott continued calling her regularly, continued lying about his location, continued building the fiction of a carefree bachelor life, while the search for his wife was dominating national news. Sharon Rocker testified at trial that when she went to East La Loma Park to help search for Lacey, she spotted Scott, and he walked away from her when she tried to approach him. He angled away, she said, when she tried to hug him. On January 24, 2003, 1 month after Lacey's disappearance, Amber Fry held a press conference and publicly disclosed the affair. She stood before a room full of reporters and said Scott had told her he was not married. From that moment, the Rocker family turned completely against their son-in-law, and the army of volunteers who had been helping search for Lacey started to understand they had been standing next to the man who killed her. Behind the scenes, Scott's actions in the weeks after Lacey vanished were telling a story of their own. Within weeks of her disappearance, he sold her Land Rover. He contacted a real estate agent about selling their home fully furnished. He converted the nautical-themed nursery they had prepared for Connor into a storage room. Then, in a television interview with Diane Sawyer, he said that door was closed until there was someone to put in there, still performing the role of a grieving husband waiting for his family to come home. In January 2003, investigators learned Scott had told one of his neighbours he had been golfing on Christmas Eve, not fishing, contradicting the story he gave police. 3 witnesses at trial confirmed he had told them the same thing. On April 13, 2003, 2 people walking their dog found the body of a male fetus washed up on a tidal flat on the shore of San Francisco Bay, at Richmond's Point Isabel. The following day, a jogger spotted a human torso in the rocks along the same shoreline, approximately 1 mile away. On April 18th, DNA tests confirmed both bodies were Lacey and Connor Peterson. The bodies had surfaced less than 4 miles from where Scott said he had gone fishing on December 24th. That same day, Scott was arrested in La Jolla, a suburb of San Diego. He had dyed his hair blonde, grown a goatee, and was carrying $14,000 to $15,000 in cash, his brother's identification, camping supplies, and multiple cell phones. Police believed he was preparing to flee across the Mexican border. At trial, which began June 1, 2004, the prosecution's case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no murder weapon, no confirmed crime scene, no eyewitness to the killing. What prosecutors had was a pattern: the secret boat, the secret affair, the researched bay currents, the planned fishing license, the concrete anchor, the hair wrapped around pliers found in the boat that DNA linked to Lacey's hairbrush, and 29 hours of recorded phone calls showing Scott lying with ease while standing at his wife's own vigils. A hydrologist testified that computer models of the bay's currents showed Lacey's body would have had to enter the water precisely where Scott said he was fishing for it to wash ashore where it did. Amber Fry took the stand in August 2004 and testified for several days, with the recorded calls played for the jury. One juror later said those tapes were the single factor that decided his vote. On November 12, 2004, the jury convicted Scott Peterson of first-degree murder with special circumstances for Lacey's death and second-degree murder for the death of Connor. Deliberations had been complicated. 2 jurors were dismissed for misconduct during the process, but the verdict, when it came, was unanimous. Crowds outside the courthouse cheered when the news was announced. On March 16, 2005, Judge Alfred DeLucci sentenced Scott to death by lethal injection, describing the murder as cruel, uncaring, heartless, and callous. He also ordered Scott to pay $10,000 toward the cost of Lacey's funeral. Scott gave no statement at sentencing. Lacey's mother Sharon addressed him directly at the resentencing hearing in December 2021, after the California Supreme Court had overturned the death sentence in 2020 due to errors in jury selection. Sharon said she still felt the grief every single day after 19 years. She called what Scott did an evil, self-centered, and unforgivable act that ended 2 beautiful souls. Scott sat expressionless in a red and orange jail uniform as she spoke. On December 8, 2021, he was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at a California state prison. He has maintained his innocence since the day of his arrest, and in January 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced it had taken on his case, seeking DNA testing on a piece of duct tape found on Lacey's body. Connor Peterson never took a single breath. Lacey's headstone at Burwood Cemetery in Kingston, Massachusetts, bears her maiden name, Rocha, rather than Peterson, a deliberate choice by her family. The nursery Scott built for a son he would never raise sat packed with storage boxes while he gave TV interviews about preserving it. The reward fund that hit $500,000 was raised by thousands of people who spent their time searching for a woman whose husband already knew exactly where she was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a mother who spent 9 days on national television weeping for the return of her 2 young sons, while they were already dead at the bottom of a lake a few miles from her house. Case 2. Susan Smith. Susan Lee Vaughn was born on September 26, 1971, in Union, South Carolina, a small mill town of around 10,000 people. Her father died by suicide when she was 6 years old. Her mother eventually remarried a man named Beverly Russell, a local businessman with ties to the South Carolina Republican Party and the Christian Coalition. When Susan was 15, she told her mother and social services that Beverly Russell had been sexually abusing her. Russell temporarily moved out of the home. Then, after some family counselling, he was allowed back in. Her mother was reportedly worried about embarrassment. The abuse continued. Russell later admitted in court that his sexual relationship with Susan had continued into her adult years, stopping only 6 months before she killed her sons. Susan attempted suicide at age 13. She attempted it again at 19 after a married man ended their affair. She met David Smith in high school. They married after she became pregnant with their first child. Their son Michael Daniel Smith was born in 1991. Their second son, Alexander Tyler Smith, was born in 1993. The marriage was unstable from the start. Both David and Susan had affairs during their time together. David filed for divorce in late 1994. They were already separated and living apart in October 1994, though they maintained a co-parenting arrangement for Michael and Alex. Susan had custody of the boys most of the time. During the months before October 1994, Susan had begun a relationship with Tom Findley, the 27-year-old son of J. Carey Findley, who owned a company called Conso International, one of the larger employers in Union. Tom was considered by many in town to be one of the most eligible bachelors in the area. Susan worked at Conso as an assistant and met Tom through the workplace. She believed the relationship could be serious. It was not. On October 17, 1994, Tom Findley sent Susan a letter ending things. The letter was later recovered from the submerged car and entered into evidence at trial. In it, Findley wrote that there were things about her that were not suited for him, and he specifically named her children. He wrote that he did not want children and did not want the responsibility of hers. He also referenced seeing her kissing another man at a social gathering as a reason the relationship could not continue. On October 25, 1994, Susan spent the afternoon and evening in a state of escalating distress. She saw Tom Findley multiple times that day at the Conso plant. Their last conversation that afternoon ended with her confessing to him about her ongoing sexual relationship with his father, and with Tom ending any remaining contact between them. That evening, Susan fed her boys dinner. Michael was 3 years old. Alex was 14 months old. She strapped them both into their car seats in the back of her 1990 Mazda Protégé. She drove toward John D. Long Lake, about 5 miles from her home on Tony Road. At the edge of the boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, just after 9 p.m, Susan put the car in neutral. She stopped. She tried again. She stopped. On the third attempt, she stepped outside, reached in, and released the brake. The car rolled down the concrete ramp and into the dark water. It took approximately 6 minutes for the Mazda to sink completely below the surface. Michael and Alex were still strapped in their car seats as the water rose around them. Susan ran to a nearby home, a white ranch house belonging to Rick and Shirley McLeod, approximately a quarter mile from the lake, and knocked on the door, crying. She told the McLeods she had been carjacked. She said a black man armed with a gun had forced his way into her car at a red light near the Monarch Mills textile plant, ordered her to drive, then pushed her out of the vehicle and sped away with her children still inside. She described the man as around 40 years old, wearing a dark knit cap, a plaid jacket, dark shirt and jeans. The McLeods called 911. Within hours, Union County Sheriff Howard Wells was at the scene. Within days, the story was national news. The 9 days that followed were a spectacle of grief that was broadcast across every major television network in the country. Susan and David Smith, though legally separated, stood side by side at press conferences and tearfully begged for the return of their sons. On November 2nd, 1994, they appeared on national television together. Susan looked into the cameras and said, "As a mother, it is only a natural instinct to protect your children from any harm, and the hardest part of this whole ordeal is not knowing if your children are getting what they need to survive." She said it the day before she confessed. A sketch of the fictional carjacker was drawn from Susan's description and distributed widely. It appeared in shop windows across Union. The Adam Walshe Foundation, the national organisation that helps locate missing children, got involved in the search. Volunteers joined law enforcement agents in searching the woods and waterways around Union. Yellow ribbons were tied to trees on Main Street. Calls and tips poured in from across the country. People were looking for a carjacker who did not exist, and 2 boys who were already at the bottom of a lake. Investigators became suspicious almost immediately. Union County Sheriff Howard Wells, who knew the Smith family personally, he was the godfather to Susan's nieces and nephews, noticed problems with her story from the very first night. The red light at the Monarch Mills intersection, where Susan claimed the carjacking happened, would only turn red if another vehicle was present on the crossing road. Susan said no other cars were around. The intersection was checked. Undercover officers had been stationed nearby that night for a separate drug operation. They saw no carjacking. They saw nothing. There were no injuries on Susan's body from the supposed struggle. The friend she claimed to have been driving to visit that night had not been expecting her. Susan submitted to polygraph tests. She failed them. FBI agent David Espy later testified that during one examination, when asked whether she knew where her children were, her deception response was at its highest level. He also noted that when she appeared to be crying, there were no actual tears. Over 9 days of careful, methodical questioning, investigators brought Susan back repeatedly and asked her to recount the events in detail. Each time, her story shifted. The timeline of the drive changed. The direction she had been facing at the intersection changed. The length of time she was in the car before being pushed out changed. Quietly, behind the press conferences and the search effort, investigators had moved on from looking for a carjacker. They were focused entirely on Susan. On the morning of November 3rd, 1994, Susan went before television cameras once more with David to make another public plea. Hours later, Sheriff Wells sat her down at a church and told her, calmly, that the alleged carjacking could not have happened the way she described, and that he was going to take what he knew to the press. Susan dropped her head into her hands. She said she was so ashamed. She asked Wells for his gun. She told him he did not understand. Then she confessed. She told investigators where the car was. Department of Natural Resources divers entered John D. Long Lake that evening. They found the Mazda 122 feet from the edge of the boat ramp. Diver Steve Morrow later testified in court about what he saw when he shone his flashlight through the murky water into the submerged vehicle. He saw a small hand against the window. The boys were still strapped in their car seats, hanging forward, heads down. Inside the car along with them was Susan's wedding dress and her photo album. After the car was recovered, Sheriff Wells held a press conference. He charged Susan Smith with 2 counts of murder for the deaths of her sons. As the news spread through the crowd of townspeople and reporters gathered outside, audible gasps could be heard. In Susan's handwritten confession, she wrote that she was in love with someone very much, but he did not love her and never would. She wrote that the worst part of what she had done was letting the boys go down the ramp without her. The prosecution at trial, led by solicitor Tommy Pope, argued the case simply. Susan Smith made a choice to put a man above her children. Tom Findley took the witness stand and confirmed the affair, the letter, and the final conversations with Susan on October 25th. Investigators showed the jury a video reenactment of the car rolling down the ramp and submerging, timed at 6 minutes. Members of the jury were visibly shaken. Susan's defense attorneys David Bruck and Judy Clark argued that Susan had intended to die alongside her boys, that it was a failed suicide, and pointed to her history of depression, her father's suicide, and the years of abuse by her stepfather. Beverly Russell himself took the stand and wept, admitting that he bore partial responsibility for what happened. He had admitted to sexually abusing Susan from the time she was 15 and acknowledged the relationship had continued into her adult years. The jury heard all of it. It took them 2.5 hours to convict her of 2 counts of murder on July 22, 1995. During the sentencing phase, David Smith took the stand for the prosecution, which was seeking the death penalty. He testified that all his hopes and dreams and everything he had planned for the rest of his life ended the day his sons died. The jury ultimately voted against the death penalty. On July 28, 1995, Judge William Howard sentenced Susan Smith to 2 concurrent life terms in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She has been incarcerated at Leith Correctional Institution in Greenwood County, South Carolina, ever since. Her time in prison included multiple disciplinary actions. 2 prison guards were fired for having sexual relations with her, and she was found to have used drugs including marijuana on multiple occasions. In 2024, She received a disciplinary conviction for contacting a documentary filmmaker from prison in violation of state law. On November 20th, 2024, 30 years after her sons drowned in John D. Long Lake, Susan Smith appeared via video link before the South Carolina Board of Paroles and Pardons for her first parole hearing. She broke down in tears and said she knew what she had done was horrible and that she would give anything to go back and change it. David Smith was there in person, wearing a pin bearing photos of Michael and Alex. He told the board he would be back every 2 years for as long as it took. The board voted unanimously to deny parole. Smith's next hearing is scheduled for 2026. Michael Daniel Smith was 3 years old. Alexander Tyler Smith was 14 months old. They are buried at Bogensville Methodist Church in West Springs, South Carolina. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case on this list involves a woman who shot her own 3 children on a back road in Oregon in 1983, drove them bleeding to the emergency room, and then spent 9 months cooperating with investigators and giving media interviews proclaiming her innocence, while police quietly built the case that she had pulled the trigger herself. Case 3. Diane Downs. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson was born on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona. She grew up in a strict conservative household. Her parents forbade makeup and fashionable clothing, and she was frequently bullied at school as a result. She later testified that her father sexually abused her as a child, though she recanted that claim in later years, and both parents denied it. At Moon Valley High School in Phoenix, she began dating a boy named Steve Downs. She enrolled at Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College in California after graduation, but was expelled after her first year for what the school described as promiscuous behavior. She returned home to Arizona. She and Steve married on November 13, 1973, after she ran away from home. She told the court years later that she did not marry him for love. She married him to get out of the family home. Their first child, Christy Ann, was born in 1974. Their second, Cheryl Lynn, followed in 1976. After Cheryl's birth, Steve had a vasectomy. Diane became pregnant again anyway, through an extramarital affair with a man named Mark Sager. That child, Stephen Daniel, known as Danny, was born in 1979. When Steve discovered Danny was not his biological son, the marriage ended. They divorced in 1980. Around that time, Diane began working as a letter carrier for the United States Postal Service and started an affair with a married co-worker named Robert Knickerbocker. Knickerbocker made it clear from the start that he did not want children. He had no interest in raising Diane's 3 kids or anyone else's. Diane became fixated on him. She wrote him letters constantly. He returned them unopened. She stalked him. Knickerbocker would later tell police he was relieved when Diane relocated to Oregon in April 1983, and that, after she left, he was able to reconcile fully with his wife. Diane took her children to Springfield, Oregon, and got a postal route in the nearby town of Cottage Grove. She believed that if she could remove her children from the picture, Knickerbocker would come to Oregon and be with her. According to Detective Doug Welch of the Lane County Sheriff's Office, who led the investigation, Diane viewed the children as obstacles. As long as they existed, Knickerbocker had told her he would not come. The quickest way to solve the problem, investigators concluded, was the one she chose. On the night of May 19, 1983, Diane drove her 3 children down Old Mohawk Road, a dark, isolated rural road outside Springfield. Christy was 8 years old, Cheryl was 7, Danny was 3. Diane stopped the car at the side of the road, retrieved a .22 caliber pistol, and shot each of her children. Then she shot herself in the left forearm. She put the gun somewhere investigators would never find it. The weapon was never recovered, and drove toward Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield. Witnesses who saw her car on the road that evening told police she was traveling at an estimated 5 to 7 miles per hour. She was not rushing. She arrived at the emergency room just before 10:30 p.m. and shouted that somebody had just shot her kids. Dr. Stephen Wilhite, a general surgeon at the hospital, was paged as he arrived home from work. He rushed back and was directed to Christy, who he believed was already dead. Her pupils were dilated. Her blood pressure was almost undetectable. She was not breathing. He saved her life. The effort required to stabilize Christy at such critically low blood pressure caused her to suffer a stroke, which would impair her ability to speak for months. Danny had been shot in the back and was permanently paralyzed from the waist down. He would never walk again. Cheryl Lynn Downs, 7 years old, was pronounced dead on arrival from a close-range gunshot wound to the chest. When Dr. Wilhite went to update Diane on Christy's condition, he was struck immediately by her manner. She showed no visible emotion, not a single tear. She asked how Christy was doing in the flat tone of someone waiting for a package. Then she told him she knew Christy was brain dead and asked him to pull the plug, meaning let her die. Wilhite refused, and a judge later issued an order making Wilhite and another doctor Christy's legal guardians, effectively removing Diane from any decision-making about her daughter's care. When Diane visited Christy in the recovery room, hospital staff noticed that Christy's heart rate spiked and her face showed visible terror each time her mother entered. Christy could not yet speak due to the stroke, but her body was communicating clearly. After arriving at the hospital, Diane's first call was not to the children's father or to family. She called Robert Knickerbocker in Arizona. Police quickly identified the call. When they reached Knickerbocker, he told them everything: the affair, her obsession with him, the stalking, her comments about being willing to kill his wife to have him to herself. He said he had been relieved when Diane left for Oregon. He confirmed to police that Diane owned a .22 caliber handgun, something she had not disclosed to investigators. Steve Downs confirmed the same independently. Diane's story did not hold up under any scrutiny from the first night. She claimed she had been out visiting a friend who owned a horse in the Marcola area, and that on the dark drive home, she took a detour down Old Mohawk Road for sightseeing. Lane County Detective Doug Welch noted the obvious problems with this. It was pitch black outside, her 3 children were asleep in the back, and she claimed to be sightseeing. She said a man stepped out from the roadside, flagged her down, demanded her car keys, shot her children when she refused, then shot her in the arm before running away. But she was right-handed, and the wound was to her left forearm, consistent with a self-inflicted wound, not an attacker shooting toward the driver. The children in the back seat were the ones with fatal and near-fatal injuries. The biggest physical threat to any would-be carjacker would have been the adult driver, not 3 sleeping toddlers. There was no blood spatter on the driver's side of the car, and no gunpowder residue on the driver's door or interior panel, which would have been impossible to explain if the shooting had happened the way Diane described. Police released information to the public, warning of a dangerous armed man on the loose, but privately, the investigation pivoted to Diane within days. Rather than retreating from the spotlight, Diane ran toward it. Within a month of the shooting, while Christy and Danny were still recovering in the hospital, she began giving interview after interview to local and national media outlets. Detective Welch later described it using the phrase, verbal vomit. She talked constantly to anyone who would listen, and the more she talked, the more her story fell apart. During one television reenactment, she laughed and joked while demonstrating what had supposedly been the most traumatic night of her life. Local reporter Anne Bradley Yeager of ABC affiliate KEZI in Eugene observed that most of Diane's interviews became primarily about Diane, what she had suffered, how she was coping, rather than about the children. To police, the behaviour of someone performing grief was becoming clearer every week. Investigators discovered Diane's private diaries. Inside them was the full map of her obsession with Knickerbocker, letters she had written begging him to come to Oregon, entries describing how certain she was that he would come, if only the children were not in the way. The diaries made the motive concrete. Ballistics experts also confirmed that unfired cartridges found in Diane's home had extractor markings that matched the casings recovered at the shooting scene on Old Mohawk Road, meaning they had been loaded and cycled through the same gun. The actual weapon was never found. On February 28, 1984, 9 months after the shooting, Diane Downs was arrested and charged with 1 count of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of criminal assault. When the trial began in May 1984, there was another development that stopped the courtroom. Diane was visibly pregnant. She had become pregnant deliberately while out on bail, before her arrest. She had even said publicly that she got pregnant because she missed Christy and Danny and Cheryl so much. District Attorney Fred Hughey, who was prosecuting the case, pressed forward. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was Christy Downs, now 9 years old, who had slowly recovered enough speech to testify. Months of physical therapy had restored her ability to communicate. On the witness stand, Fred Hughey asked Christy if she remembered who shot her. Christy said, "My mum." She described how Diane had pulled the car over on the dark road, gotten something from the trunk, and then shot each of her children. She described watching her mother shoot herself in the arm. Christy Downs was 9 years old when she stood in a courtroom and told a jury that her mother had tried to kill her. On June 17, 1984, Diane Downs was convicted on all charges. The judge sentenced her to life in prison plus 50 years, with most of the sentence to be served consecutively. He made clear he had no intention of ever releasing her. She was required to serve 25 years before becoming eligible for parole. Between the verdict and sentencing, the court recessed so Diane could give birth. She delivered a girl she named Amy Elizabeth. 10 days before sentencing, the state of Oregon seized the baby, who was subsequently adopted by a family named Babcock and renamed Rebecca. Christy and Danny, Diane's surviving children, were eventually adopted in 1986 by Fred Hughey, the lead prosecutor who had put their mother in prison, and his wife Joanne. Both children built private lives after their ordeal. Christy later graduated from college, married, and had a daughter of her own, whom she named Cheryl after her sister. In July 1987, just 3 years into her sentence at the Oregon Women's Correctional Center in Salem, Diane scaled an 18-foot razor wire fence and escaped. A 14-state manhunt lasted 10 days before she was located just a few blocks from the prison, hiding at the home of another inmate's husband. She received an additional 5 years for the escape. Fred Hughey lobbied successfully to have her transferred out of Oregon entirely, arguing that her proximity to Christy and Danny, who were living 66 miles from the Salem prison, posed an unacceptable risk if she escaped again. She was sent first to a facility in New Jersey, then eventually to California. Diane Downs has been denied parole in 2008, 2010, 2020, and again in December 2025. Psychiatrists have consistently diagnosed her with narcissistic, histrionic, and antisocial personality disorders. The Oregon Board of Parole and Post-Prison Supervision found in its most recent ruling that her mental and emotional condition continues to make her a danger to the health and safety of others, and scheduled her next parole consideration hearing for 2031. She has maintained her innocence in every hearing since 1984. In later years, she changed her story repeatedly, describing 2 men in ski masks, then drug dealers, then corrupt law enforcement, none of which matched any evidence in the case. Cheryl Lynn Downs was 7 years old. She had asked a neighbour once, not long before May 19, 1983, whether there was a gun in the house. When the neighbour asked why, Cheryl said, "I want to kill me. My mum says I'm bad." She was the only one who did not survive the night her mother drove her down Old Mohawk Road. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a man who was not only present during the search for his victim, he was a law enforcement officer himself, which gave him a level of access and credibility that allowed him to operate in plain sight for years while 2 of his wives either turned up dead or simply vanished without a trace. Case 4. Drew Peterson. Drew Walter Peterson was born on January 5, 1954, in Bolingbrook, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. He graduated from Willowbrook High School in Villa Park in 1972 and joined the United States Army shortly afterward. After his discharge, he joined the Bolingbrook Police Department in 1977. He worked patrol, then moved to the Metropolitan Area Narcotics Squad as an undercover officer. The department gave him a Police Officer of the Year award in 1979. He would go on to serve as a Bolingbrook police sergeant for 30 years, retiring in November 2007 with a rank that gave him both institutional authority and detailed knowledge of exactly how police investigations worked. He was married 4 times. His first wife was Carol Brown, his high school girlfriend. They divorced after roughly 6 years because of his infidelity. His second wife, Victoria Connolly, later described their 9.5 years together as marked by violence and control. She told interviewers that he once put her up against the wall in the garage and grabbed her by the throat. She also said he told her he would kill her and make it look like an accident. That marriage ended when she discovered he was having an affair with an accountant named Kathleen Savio. He had been carrying on the affair while still married to Connolly. He married Kathleen Savio on May 3, 1992, 2 months after his divorce from Connolly was finalised. They had 2 sons together, Thomas, born in 1993, and Christopher, born in 1994. The marriage to Savio was volatile from early on. Between 2002 and 2004, Bolingbroke police were called to their home 18 times for domestic disturbances. Savio filed for an order of protection against Peterson in 2002, stating in the filing that he wanted her dead and that she believed he would burn the house down just to shut her up. She went further than that. She reportedly told the Bolingbroke police chief directly, "If anything happens to me, it was Drew who killed me." She wrote to a local Fox News reporter, laying out in writing her belief that Peterson was using his connections inside the department to ensure nothing happened to him, no matter what he did. Peterson had Savio charged with domestic battery twice during the course of their dispute. She was acquitted both times. He was never charged with anything. While still married to Savio, Peterson began a relationship with Stacey Ann Cales, who was 17 years old when they started seeing each other. In October 2001, an anonymous letter arrived in Savio's mailbox, informing her that her husband was having an affair with a teenage village employee, and that everyone at the police department already knew about it. Savio and Peterson separated after she received the letter, and divorce proceedings began. Their divorce was finalised on October 10, 2003. Just 8 days later, Peterson married Stacey, who was 19 years old at the time. Drew Peterson was 49. They lived less than a mile from the home he had shared with Savio and had 2 children together, Anthony, born in 2003, and Lacey, born in 2005. Stacey legally adopted Savio's 2 sons and treated them as her own. By 2007, she was close to completing a nursing degree at Joliet Junior College. On March 1, 2004, less than 5 months after the divorce was finalised, and while the court was still working out the division of assets, including Peterson's pension, Kathleen Savio's body was found in her home at 392 Pheasant Chase Drive in Bolingbroke. She was 40 years old. A neighbour, Steve Carcerano, discovered her body. Peterson had called a locksmith to open her front door after failing to reach her over the weekend when he came to return their sons. Savio was found face down in her dry bathtub, her hair soaked in blood, a 2-inch gash on the back of her head. She was nude. The bathtub was dry. Her body had extensive bruising and scraping across her back, torso and face. A coroner's jury ruled the death an accidental drowning. A police officer on the jury, who personally knew Peterson, told the other jurors that he was a good man who would never hurt his wife. Peterson was never charged. He put the house up for sale within a month of Savio's death, and the divorce case, which would have awarded Savio a portion of his pension, died with her. Stacey Peterson had given Drew an alibi for the night of Savio's death. She told police he was with her. It would be the alibi that held for 3 years. On Sunday, October 28, 2007, Stacey Peterson was 23 years old. She had spoken to a friend that morning about helping paint an apartment. She never showed up. Her sister, Cassandra Cales, spent the afternoon unable to reach her by phone. She went to the Peterson house at around 11 p.m. and found the children there, but no Stacey. The children told her their parents had argued and that Stacey had gone to their grandfather's house. Cassandra reached Peterson on his cell phone at 11:26 p.m. He told her, "Your sister left me." She filed a missing persons report the next morning, October 29th. What had been happening in the Peterson home in the days before Stacey vanished was being pieced together even as the search for her was underway. Days before her disappearance, Stacey had told a divorce attorney named Harry Smith that she knew her husband had killed Kathleen Savio and she was thinking of leaving him. She had told her pastor, Reverend Neil Shorey, the same thing, that Drew had confessed to killing Savio and had coached her to lie to police about his whereabouts that night. On the same day Stacey disappeared, her stepbrother Thomas Morphy told police an alarming story. He said Peterson had come to his home on October 27th and asked him, "How much do you love me?" Then, "Enough to kill for me?" Morphy said no. Peterson pressed, "Could you live with knowing about it?" Then, on October 28th, Morphy said he was at the Peterson home when Drew came out of the master bedroom, pushing a large blue plastic barrel. Peterson asked him to help carry it downstairs and load it into his SUV. The barrel was approximately 4 feet long and appeared to weigh around 120 pounds. It was warm to the touch. Peterson told Morphy this never happened. He then drove Morphy home. 2 days later, Morphy attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. He survived and told investigators he was convinced he had helped Drew dispose of Stacy's body. Illinois State Police named Peterson a suspect in Stacy's disappearance on November 9, 2007. Divers searched a canal south of Chicago for weeks, looking for the blue barrel. Volunteers from a Texas-based search organization called EquiSearch were asked by police to watch for a large blue plastic container during their ground searches. Peterson resigned from the Bolingbrook Police Department in November 2007, but initially continued to collect his pension of $6,067.71 per month, which the pension board said they were legally required to allow since he had not been convicted of any crime. While the search for Stacy was ongoing and investigators were re-examining Savio's death, Drew Peterson relished the national media attention. He gave interviews on The Today Show and Larry King Live. He joked on radio programs about Stacy's disappearance. On The Today Show, he said that Stacy would ask him for a divorce on a regular basis and that it was based on her menstrual cycle. He suggested a win-a-date with Drew contest. He got engaged to a 23-year-old woman named Christina Rains in December 2008. Her father publicly celebrated when she called it off the following month. In April 2008, Peterson offered a $25,000 reward for information about Stacy's whereabouts and appeared on Larry King Live. His court-appointed trial judge was eventually forced to issue a gag order to limit his media access. Savio's body was exhumed on November 16, 2007. Dr. Michael Barden, a former New York City medical examiner, conducted the examination and concluded she died by drowning following a physical struggle, not from an accidental fall. Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow announced that the death was a homicide staged to look like an accident. Peterson was arrested on May 7, 2009 and charged with Savio's murder. Bail was set at $20 million. His trial began in July 2012. The trial was built almost entirely on hearsay evidence, statements made by people who were either dead or missing. Savio herself had told multiple people that Peterson threatened to kill her and had put a knife to her throat, saying he could kill her and make it look like an accident. Stacy had told her pastor and a divorce attorney that Peterson had confessed to killing Savio. To allow this testimony, the Illinois legislature passed a law in 2008 that became known as Drew's Law, permitting hearsay statements to be admitted in cases where prosecutors could show the defendant had killed the witness to prevent their testimony. The law was written specifically because of this case. A witness named Jeff Pachter also testified that Peterson had offered him $25,000 to hire someone to kill Savio before her death, and that Peterson wanted the crime to be a secret he would take to his grave. After nearly 14 hours of deliberation, the jury of 7 men and 5 women convicted Drew Peterson of the premeditated first-degree murder of Kathleen Savio on September 6, 2012. Jurors said afterward that the hearsay testimony, Stacy's voice coming through witnesses, was the most compelling evidence in the case. Savio's mother Marcia, speaking outside the courthouse, said, "Finally, somebody heard Kathleen's cry." At the sentencing hearing on February 21, 2013, Peterson shouted from the courtroom, "I did not kill Kathleen." Someone in the gallery shouted back, "Yes, you did." Judge Edward Burmiller sentenced him to 38 years in prison. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld the conviction in September 2017. From inside Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, Peterson arranged for a fellow inmate named Antonio Smith, a member of a gang known as the Satan's Disciples, to arrange the murder of Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow, the prosecutor who had put him in prison. Smith wore an FBI wire and recorded multiple conversations. On a recording from November 13th, 2014, Smith asked Peterson whether the plan to kill Glasgow would help him get out of prison. Peterson said yes. Peterson was charged with solicitation of murder and solicitation of murder for hire in February 2015. A jury convicted him in May 2016 in under an hour.
He was sentenced to an additional 40 years to be served after completing the Savio sentence. His pension was revoked in May 2016. He is currently incarcerated at the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City, Indiana, where he is listed as inmate 279193. Stacy Peterson has never been found. Illinois State Police named Drew Peterson their sole suspect in her disappearance. He has never been charged in connection with it. Stacy's sister Cassandra Cales has never stopped looking. In 2018, she launched a fundraising campaign to search a canal in Lockport, Illinois, where she believes Stacy's remains may be located. As of the time this script was researched, Stacy Peterson has been missing for more than 17 years. Kathleen Savio told everyone around her exactly what was going to happen to her. She told the police chief. She wrote letters to reporters. She filed court documents. Nobody stopped it. Her body was found in a dry bathtub with a gash in her skull and bruises across her entire body, and a coroner's jury called it an accident. It took the disappearance of a second woman, who was 19 years old when she married the man who investigators believe eventually killed her too, for the truth about Kathleen Savio to finally reach a jury. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a killer who did not run from the search for his victims. He literally led investigators through the crime scene himself, guiding police to body after body, buried at multiple locations across Texas and the Gulf Coast. While the families of those boys had no idea the person showing officers where their sons were buried was the same one who had put them there. Case 5. Elmer Wayne Henley. Houston Heights was a low-income neighborhood in northwest Houston, Texas, in the early 1970s. It was the kind of place where families knew each other, where teenagers walked to swimming pools together and hung around the same fast food restaurants on the same streets. Starting in December 1970, boys from that neighborhood began disappearing. By May 1971, at least 5 teenagers had vanished within that year alone. Police classified them almost universally as runaways. No serious investigation was launched. No one went looking. The families were left to search on their own. One of the teenagers who showed up at the Hilligist family home to help after 13-year-old David Hilligist and his 16-year-old friend Gregory Malleywinkle disappeared on May 29, 1971, was a 15-year-old named Elmer Wayne Henley. He had been a lifelong friend of David Hilligist. He came to the house, asked for missing persons posters, pinned them up around the Heights, and told David's mother that there was probably an innocent explanation for the boy's prolonged absence. He kept coming back to check in and reassure her. What Elmer Wayne Henley did not tell Dorothy Hilligist was that David and Gregory were already dead. They had been abducted and murdered by Dean Arnold Call, the 31-year-old man Henley had recently begun spending time with. Dean Call was born on December 24, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His family moved to Texas when he was young, and in the 1960s, his mother opened a candy factory in Houston Heights called Call Candy Company. Dean worked there and eventually became vice president. He was known in the neighborhood as a generous, friendly man who gave free candy to local children. Families trusted him. He was pleasant, quiet, and appeared to have no criminal history. He hosted parties for teenagers at whichever apartment he was renting at the time. Parties involving alcohol, glue sniffing, and marijuana. He was a predator who had spent years building exactly the kind of trust that made what he was doing possible. Call began paying a 14-year-old boy named David Owen Brooks for access to boys. Brooks had been groomed by Call since he was a child, showered with gifts, a car, money, and had been sexually abused by Call for years before he understood what was happening. In exchange for $200 per victim, Brooks began luring teenage boys from the neighborhood to Call's apartment. The boys were restrained to a plywood board Call had built with handcuffs at each corner, sexually tortured for hours or days, and then killed, either by strangulation or by a single shot from a .22 caliber pistol.
Their bodies were buried in a boat storage shed Call rented on Silverbell Street in southwest Houston, at a wooded area near Lake Sam Rayburn in East Texas, and at High Island Beach on the Gulf Coast, roughly 80 miles east of Houston. In the winter of 1971, Brooks introduced Henley to Call. Henley was 15 years old. His parents had recently divorced, his father was out of the picture, and he had dropped out of junior high to help support his mother and 3 younger siblings by working part-time jobs. He was financially desperate. Call initially told Henley he was involved in a burglary operation and paid him small amounts of cash for stealing. Then Call told Henley the same lie he had told Brooks, that he was part of an organization in California that bought boys for a homosexual sex ring, and that Henley could earn $200 for each teenager he delivered. Henley initially refused to participate in the procurement of victims for months. Then his family's financial situation got worse. In early 1972, he agreed to help. The first boy Henley directly helped lure was a 17-year-old whose name investigators recorded only as an unknown victim. Shortly after, on March 24, 1972, Henley approached his own friend, Frank Aguirre, an 18-year-old who worked at the Long John Silver's restaurant on 23rd Street, where Henley regularly spent time, and brought him to Call's apartment under the pretense of drinking beer and smoking marijuana. At Call's address, Aguirre was handcuffed. When Henley realized what was happening, he later claimed he tried to stop Call. Call refused. Aguirre was raped, tortured, and strangled. Then Call told Henley the truth, that David Hilligist and Gregory Malley Winkle, Henley's childhood friends whose missing posters he had been distributing around the neighborhood for months, were also dead and buried in the boat shed. Henley had been telling their mother to keep hope. He had been reassuring her that there was probably an innocent explanation. He had been doing it while knowing, at some level, what Call was. Henley kept going. He continued luring boys to Call's home across 1972 and into 1973. Several were his own friends, classmates and neighbours. Frank Aguirre had been his friend. Mark Scott, 17, was a boy who had recently thrown a party at his own house that Henley had attended and been the last to leave. Johnny Delome was a former junior high classmate. Homer Garcia had taken driver's education classes with Henley. Billy Lawrence was a 15-year-old from the same neighbourhood. Charles Cobble and Marty Jones were both 17. Investigators later determined that Henley personally participated in the killing of at least 6 of the victims. He confessed to actively participating in strangulation, in the use of the torture board, and in the burials. He was 16 years old when he committed the first murder he was charged with. He helped bury victims at the boat shed, at Lake Sam Rayburn, and at High Island Beach. He knew every location. He had been at most of them himself. On the night of August 7, 1973, Henley brought 2 more teenagers to Call's house at 2020 Lamar Drive in Pasadena, a suburb of Houston. They were 20-year-old Timothy Curley and 15-year-old Rhonda Williams. Call was furious about Williams being there, telling Henley that a girl had no place in what he was doing. The 3 teenagers were drinking and inhaling paint fumes through the night. At some point, they fell asleep. When they woke in the early hours of August 8, 1973, Curley and Williams were bound and restrained. Henley was also tied. Call told Henley he was going to kill all 3 of them. Henley talked Call into untying him, promising to help with the others. Once free, Henley waited, then grabbed Call's .22 caliber pistol. He shot Call 6 times, 3 times in the front, 3 in the back. Dean Call, 33 years old, died on the hallway floor of his own house. Timothy Curley and Rhonda Williams survived. Henley called the Pasadena Police Department. The dispatcher who answered, a woman named Velma, had barely asked if there was an emergency before Henley said, "Y'all better come here right now, I just killed a man." Pasadena homicide detective David Mullican responded to the scene. It appeared initially to be a routine homicide involving teenagers and drug use. Then Henley started talking. He told investigators that for almost 3 years, he and David Brooks had been procuring teenage boys from Houston Heights for Dean Call, who had raped, tortured, and murdered them. He said Call had paid him and Brooks $200 per victim. He said most of the bodies were buried in a boat shed in southwest Houston. He named 3 boys whose disappearances had been reported to police: Charles Cobble, David Hilligist, and Marty Jones. When detectives called Houston Police Department headquarters to check, all 3 were listed as missing. Later that same day, August 8, 1973, Henley led police to the boat storage shed on Silverbell Street. They began digging. 8 bodies were recovered before nightfall. The next morning, 9 more were found at the same location, bringing the total to 17 from the boat shed alone. Then Henley led investigators to the wooded area near Lake Sam Rayburn. 4 more bodies were recovered there. On August 13th, both Henley and David Brooks, who had turned himself into police the day after Henley's arrest, accompanied investigators to High Island Beach, where 4 more bodies were found, bringing the total number of confirmed victims to 27. At the time, it was the worst case of serial murder in the history of the United States, surpassing the 25 murders attributed to Juan Corona in California 2 years earlier. Many of the bodies were in severe states of decomposition. Some had been buried with lime to speed the process. They were identified through dental records, personal belongings found with the remains, and broken bone histories. Buried with the first body recovered, 13-year-old James Stanton Dremala, the last boy Call had killed, was the bicycle he had been riding when Call lured him just 5 days before Henley shot him. Donald and Jerry Waldrop, brothers aged 15 and 13, were found in a shared grave in the boat shed. Billy Lawrence's father recognized Henley as a boy his son had befriended before vanishing. David Hilligist's mother, Dorothy, the woman Henley had consoled at her door while distributing reward posters for her missing son, learned the truth in the same week that the search parties were digging up the boat shed. Elmer Wayne Henley was 17 years old at the time of Call's death. The killing of Call was ruled justifiable self-defense. Henley was not charged for that. He was tried in San Antonio in July 1974 on 6 counts of murder. The 6 victims prosecutors could directly connect to his participation. He did not take the stand in his own defense. The jury convicted him on all 6 counts and sentenced him to 6 consecutive 99-year terms in prison. An appeal overturned that conviction in 1978 on procedural grounds. He was retried in 1979 in Corpus Christi and convicted again, this time receiving 6 concurrent 99-year terms. David Brooks was tried separately and convicted of 1 count of murder, receiving a life sentence. He died in prison in April 2020 of COVID-19 at age 65. One victim from the boat shed has never been identified. His remains have been in storage at the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office for more than 50 years. Elmer Wayne Henley is currently in his late 60s and remains incarcerated in a Texas state prison. He has been denied parole multiple times. As of 2022, he submitted a request for compassionate release on the grounds of illness. Families of the victims have organised opposition to every parole hearing. The sister of James Dremala, the 13-year-old who had been trying to save enough money to take his girlfriend to a James Bond movie when Call lured him from his bicycle 5 days before his death, submitted a statement to the parole board. He did not deserve any compassion, she wrote, because her brother had not been treated with basic humanity. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case in this list takes a different form entirely. Instead of a killer who helped search for the victims he buried, the next case involves a man who took the stage at the most public moment of a murder investigation and used it to his advantage, standing at a podium making desperate pleas while detectives stood just yards away running a search operation on the property behind him. Case 6. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a working-class Irish Catholic household on the northwest side of the city. His father was an alcoholic who beat his children with a razor strap and regularly told John he was stupid, weak, and would amount to nothing. Despite that, Gacy built exactly the kind of life that made neighbours trust him and authorities leave him alone. By the mid-1970s, he owned a successful construction company called PDM Contractors, employed dozens of teenagers and young men, served as a Democratic Party precinct captain in Norwood Park Township,
and performed at children's hospitals and charity events dressed as a clown character he called Pogo. In 1978, he was photographed standing next to First Lady Rosalind Carter at a Democratic Party event, wearing a pin that indicated he had been cleared by the Secret Service. He was 36 years old. Beneath the crawl space of his ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in unincorporated Norwood Park Township, the bodies of 26 young men and boys were already buried. What almost nobody in his community knew was that Gacy had a prior criminal record. In 1968, in Waterloo, Iowa, he was convicted of sodomy after assaulting a teenage boy. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and served 18 months before being released on parole in 1970. The Iowa Board of Parole never learned about several subsequent incidents in which Gacy was accused of sexual assault against teenagers after his release. His Iowa conviction was sealed in November 1971, 1 month after his parole ended. He bought his house on Summerdale Avenue shortly afterward with financial help from his mother. Every murder he ever committed took place inside that house. His victims were mostly young men between the ages of 14 and 21. He lured them through job offers at PDM, by approaching strangers at Chicago's Greyhound bus station, and by cruising streets and picking up hitchhikers. Once inside his home, he would perform what he described as a magic trick, getting the young man to put on a pair of handcuffs, which he would then show were real. He would then rape and torture them before killing them by asphyxiation or strangulation using a ligature he called a garrote, sometimes a rope or a length of cord twisted tight with a stick. He buried the first 26 victims in the crawl space beneath his house, using lime to mask the smell. When the crawl space ran out of room, he buried 3 more elsewhere on the property. His last 5 victims, including his final known victim, were thrown from the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River. He was questioned about missing people connected to him several times across the years he was killing, and each time he walked away without consequence. In July 1975, an 18-year-old PDM employee named John Butkovich disappeared after going to Gacy's house to collect unpaid wages. Butkovich's parents asked police to look into Gacy. Nothing came of it. In December 1976, a 17-year-old PDM employee named Gregory Godzik vanished. Before disappearing, Godzik had told his family that Gacy had been having him dig trenches in the crawl space of his home. His parents contacted Gacy directly. Gacy told them Gregory had confided he wanted to run away from home, and that he had even left a voicemail message saying so. When the family asked to hear the message, Gacy said he had already erased it. Police accepted his account. In January 1977, a 19-year-old named John Cizik disappeared after going to meet Gacy about selling his car. Months later, a teenager was stopped at a gas station driving Cizik's Plymouth Satellite and said the man he lived with had bought the car from Cizik. That man was Gacy. He told police Cizik had sold him the vehicle to raise money before leaving town. Police never checked the car title, which had been signed 18 days after Cizik's disappearance, in a signature that did not match Cizik's own handwriting. In March 1978, a 26-year-old man named Jeffrey Rignall was chloroformed, driven to Gacy's house, raped and tortured for hours, then dumped unconscious in a Chicago park. He had visible burns on his face from the chloroform. He went to police and filed a complaint. Authorities did not pursue it seriously. Rignall eventually tracked Gacy down himself by waiting at a highway exit he recognized from one of and followed it to the Summerdale Avenue house. He filed formal charges. They were still pending when Gacy committed his final murder. On the evening of December 11, 1978, Gacy was at the Nissan Pharmacy in Des Plaines, discussing a remodeling contract with the store owner. While he was there, he mentioned to the staff that his company paid teenage workers around $5 an hour. A 15-year-old part-time employee named Robert Peast heard this and told a co-worker he was going outside to talk to the contractor about a job. He asked his mother, Elizabeth Peast, who had come to the store to pick him up for her birthday dinner, to wait a few minutes. She waited more than 20 minutes. Robert never came back. The family searched the neighborhood that night and called police. The next morning, Des Plaines Detective Lieutenant Joseph Kozenzak
ran a background check on Gacy, something Chicago police had apparently not done when Rignall filed his assault complaint, and found the sealed Iowa sodomy conviction. A search warrant was obtained for the Summerdale Avenue house. Police searched the house on December 13th. They found handcuffs, driver's licenses belonging to other people, a 2x4 with holes drilled in the ends, syringes, a class ring later traced to John Zick, and a pharmacy film receipt that had been in Robert Peast's jacket pocket. They also noticed a foul odour rising from the basement. They attributed it to plumbing and left. While detectives continued their investigation over the following days, 2 surveillance teams were assigned to follow Gacy around the clock. Gacy knew he was being watched, and according to one of the officers assigned to him, seemed to enjoy it, regularly inviting the surveillance detectives to join him for meals and acting as though the whole thing amused him. On the night of December 20th, Gacy drove to the office of his attorney, Sam Amirante, in Park Ridge. The surveillance officers waited outside while Gacy spent hours inside. Amirante later wrote that Gacy poured out a detailed confession over several hours, telling him everything, including that Robert Peast and 4 other victims had been thrown from the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River because the crawl space had become too full. He told his lawyer he had been the judge, jury, and executioner of many people. He was not arrested that night because Amirante was bound by attorney-client privilege. The following day, December 21st, surveillance officers arrested Gacy on a minor marijuana possession charge after observing him with drugs at a gas station. That gave investigators the time they needed for a second search warrant. When they entered the crawl space on December 21st, they found human remains. On December 22, 1978, Gacy gave a formal confession to police, admitting to killing approximately 25 to 30 young men and boys. The following day, December 23rd, he was taken back to his house and instructed to mark with orange spray paint on the garage floor the exact location where he had buried John Butkovich, the PDM employee who had vanished in 1975 after coming to collect his wages. He then sat with Detective Mike Albrecht. During that conversation, according to Albrecht, Gacy asked for a piece of paper and drew a diagram of his crawl space, marking where the bodies were buried. Albrecht said the diagram was remarkably accurate. Gacy was then driven to the I-55 bridge over the Des Plaines River so he could point out the precise location from which he had thrown Robert Peast and the other 4 victims into the water. Excavation of the crawl space began on December 26th. 26 bodies were recovered from the crawl space over the following weeks. 3 more were found buried elsewhere on the property, 1 beneath the garage floor, 2 in the driveway area. The bodies were in advanced states of decomposition. The Cook County medical examiner marked each burial site with a numbered flag and catalogued each set of remains separately. Identification was made primarily through dental records, physical descriptions, and items found buried with the victims. James Dre Marler, the last boy Call had killed the previous decade, had been found with his bicycle in the boat shed. The last person Gacy killed was 15-year-old Robert Peast, whose body was recovered from a lock on the Illinois River in April 1979, 4 months after his murder. Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense team argued he had moments of temporary insanity during each killing and pointed to 3 psychiatrists who diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder. Prosecutors called their own psychiatric experts, who said Gacy had a personality disorder but was fully in control of his actions, and that the careful, systematic burial of 26 bodies in a crawl space was evidence of deliberate planning, not psychosis. Prosecutor William Kunkel, in one of the most striking moments of the trial, gathered photographs of all the victims and threw them through the opening of the crawl space trapdoor that had been set up as a courtroom exhibit, scattering them across the floor in front of the jury box. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 45 minutes. On March 13, 1980, Gacy was convicted of all 33 murders, the highest number of murder convictions recorded against a single individual in United States legal history at the time. He was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center, filing appeal after appeal. None succeeded. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld the conviction. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear his case. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. He was 52 years old.
For his last meal, he ordered a bucket of fried chicken, a dozen fried shrimp, French fries, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. When investigators first reopened the identification effort in 2011, 8 of Gacy's 33 victims were still unidentified. DNA technology and forensic genetic genealogy have since given names to 3 of them: 16-year-old James Byron Harkinson, identified in 2017, and 21-year-old Francis Wayne Alexander, identified in 2021, among others. As of the time this script was researched, 5 of Gacy's victims remain unidentified. They are buried in a Chicago cemetery beneath headstones that read, "We remembered." Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case on this list takes the dynamic in a completely different direction, away from the urban sprawl of Chicago and back to rural America, and back much further in time, to a case where a killer did not guide police through burial sites in a city crawlspace, but instead led a search party through a pitch-dark field to the body of his own brother, on a farm in small-town Wisconsin where nobody would ask questions for another 13 years. Case 7. Ed Gein. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He was the second son of George Gein, a largely unemployable alcoholic who beat his children, and Augusta Gein, a fanatically religious woman who believed the outside world was crawling with sin and corruption. Around 1915, Augusta moved the family to a 195-acre farm on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a decision she made deliberately to keep her sons away from people she considered immoral. The nearest neighbours were a quarter of a mile away. The boys were not allowed to socialise freely. They went to school and came home, and the farm was the world Augusta wanted them to occupy permanently. Augusta read to her sons from the Bible every afternoon, selected passages about death, murder, and divine punishment. She taught them that all women outside of herself were wicked and that sexual desire was a curse. She told both her sons to remain virgins. Ed absorbed all of this. He idolised his mother completely and took everything she told him as gospel. His older brother Henry did not. As the boys grew into adults, Henry began to pull away from Augusta's influence. He started dating a divorced woman with 2 children and was planning to move in with her. He openly criticised his mother in front of Ed, something Ed found deeply upsetting. Henry told people around him that he worried about how attached Ed had become to Augusta. In Ed's eyes, his brother was betraying the most important person in either of their lives. George Gein died from heart failure on April 1, 1940. He was 66 years old. After his death, Ed and Henry worked odd jobs around Plainfield to support the household. The community considered both of them reliable handymen. Ed also babysat for neighbours and seemed more comfortable around children than adults. But the tension between the brothers around Augusta had grown into something that could not easily be walked back. On May 16, 1944, the Gein brothers were burning vegetation on marshland near the family farm. The fire grew out of control, eventually requiring intervention from the local fire department. By the time the flames were extinguished and the firefighters left, night had fallen. Ed told police he had lost track of his brother in the smoke and confusion. He reported Henry missing. Deputy Sheriff Frank Engel organised a search party and arrived at the farm with lanterns and flashlights. When the search party set out across the scorched land in the dark, Ed Gein led them directly to Henry's body. Henry Gein was 43 years old. He was found lying face down on an area of ground that the fire had not burned. His body showed no burn injuries. Investigators noted unexplained bruises on the back of his head. Ed had claimed he could not find his brother, that he had been unable to locate him after they became separated. Yet when police arrived, he walked directly to where Henry lay. No explanation was ever offered for how he knew exactly where the body was in the dark, on unburned ground, after claiming to have been searching unsuccessfully for hours. No autopsy was performed. The county coroner listed the cause of death as asphyxiation. The theory accepted at the time was that Henry had succumbed to smoke inhalation.
The unusual bruises were noted and then set aside. No official investigation was opened. The case was closed as an accident. Decades later, when investigators were questioning Ed Gein about his 1957 murders, state investigator Joe Wilimowski brought up Henry's death. Scholar George Arndt, who studied the case extensively, wrote that in retrospect it was, in his words, possible and likely that Henry's death was what he called the Cain and Abel aspect of the case. Ed denied harming his brother. No charge was ever filed. No one will ever know with certainty what happened on that farm on May 16, 1944, because no thorough investigation was ever conducted. What is certain is that Ed led searchers directly to the body of a man he had claimed he could not find, in the dark, in an unburned area, with bruises on the back of his skull. Henry's death left Ed alone with his mother. Augusta suffered a paralysing stroke shortly after. For the next year and a half, Ed cared for her entirely, tending to every need. She suffered a second stroke and died on December 29, 1945, at the age of 67. Ed Gein was 39 years old and had never lived away from home. He had no romantic relationships, no close friends outside the farm, and no framework for existing in the world without the woman who had defined every day of his life. He sealed her bedroom and sitting room exactly as she had left them, furniture untouched, items in place, and preserved them like rooms in a museum. The rest of the farmhouse fell into filth and ruin around those sealed rooms, while Ed lived alone in the kitchen and a small back space. What happened next took more than a decade to come to light. Starting around 1947, Gein began making night visits to 3 local cemeteries: Plainfield Cemetery, Spiritland Cemetery, and Hancock Cemetery. He went to freshly dug graves. He selected middle-aged women who resembled his mother. He dug them up, removed their remains, and brought parts of them back to the farm. He admitted to as many as 40 nocturnal cemetery visits after his arrest, and confessed to robbing 9 graves. He led investigators to those graves, and 3 were opened to confirm his account. They were found empty or disturbed exactly as he described. Back at the farm, he used the remains to build a world around himself. Investigators later catalogued what they found: skull bowls, lampshades, and chair coverings made from human skin, a corset fashioned from a female torso, face masks peeled from the skulls of women, boxes of organs, a belt made from human nipples, and a vest constructed from preserved female skin with breasts still attached, a garment he reportedly wore while dancing alone in his yard at night. He later told investigators he was trying to become his mother. The farm had no electricity in most rooms. Neighbours who occasionally visited noticed strange objects on the walls, but Gein told them they were war souvenirs brought back by a cousin who had served in the Pacific. In December 1954, Mary Hogan, the 51-year-old owner of a tavern in the nearby town of Bancroft, disappeared. Blood was found at the bar. Her car was still there. No suspect was identified. The case went cold. Gein had been a regular at her bar. She was a middle-aged woman who bore a resemblance to Augusta. On November 16, 1957, 58-year-old Bernice Warden, who owned the hardware store in Plainfield, went missing. It was the opening day of deer hunting season, and the store had been quiet all day. Her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Warden, entered the store around 5 p.m. and found the cash register open and blood on the floor. The last receipt written by Bernice that morning was for a gallon of antifreeze sold to Ed Gein. Frank Warden told investigators Gein had been in the store the previous evening and said he would return the next morning. Gein was arrested that evening at a neighbour's house. When officers searched the Gein farm, they found Bernice Warden's body in a shed at the back of the property. She was hanging upside down from the ceiling, headless and disemboweled. She had been shot once in the head with a .22 caliber rifle, and then field dressed like a deer carcass. Her head was found inside the house in a burlap sack. Her heart was in a plastic bag near the stove. The rest of what investigators found inside the farmhouse took them hours to process. In addition to everything made from grave-robbed remains, they also found the preserved face of Mary Hogan, fashioned into a mask, confirming what had become of her 3 years earlier. Gein confessed to killing both women. He claimed he did not remember all of what happened the morning he killed Bernice Worden, telling a psychiatrist that he examined a rifle in her store and it discharged accidentally. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and found unfit to stand trial. He was committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. His farmhouse burned to the ground in March 1958, one night before it was scheduled to be auctioned. The cause was never officially determined. In 1968, 11 years after his arrest, doctors found Gein mentally competent to stand trial. His trial for the murder of Bernice Worden began on November 7, 1968, and lasted 1 week. A judge heard the case without a jury. Gein was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was then ruled legally insane at the time of the crime and returned to a psychiatric institution rather than sent to prison. He was never tried for the murder of Mary Hogan or for any of the 9 confirmed grave robberies. He lived the rest of his life at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, where nurses described him as quiet, polite, and almost childlike. He died of respiratory failure caused by lung cancer on July 26, 1984. He was 77 years old. He was buried in Plainfield Cemetery near his parents and Henry. Visitors chipped pieces from his gravestone over the years as souvenirs, and in June 2000, the entire stone was stolen. It was recovered near Seattle and placed in storage. The grave has been left unmarked since. Norman Bates was based on him, so was Leatherface, so was Buffalo Bill. The 3 most iconic fictional murderers in the history of American horror were all drawn, in part, from the same quiet Wisconsin handyman who spent his days babysitting neighborhood children while spending his nights digging up their grandmothers. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves away from the isolated farms of rural Wisconsin and into the Boston suburbs, where a young husband and father reported his wife and infant daughter missing in January 2006 and voluntarily cooperated with investigators while saying everything the right way, before police found the bodies in his own home and before anyone realized he had already fled the country. Case 8. Neil Entwistle. Neil Entwistle was born on September 18, 1978, in Worksop, a small town in Nottinghamshire, England. His father worked as a coal miner. His mother was a school canteen cook. He grew up in a working-class household and proved to be academically capable, eventually earning a master's degree in electronic engineering from the University of York. At university in 1999, he met an American student named Rachel Souza, who was spending a year abroad. She had grown up in Massachusetts, graduated from the College of the Holy Cross, and returned to England afterward to earn a teaching certificate and be with Neil. They married on August 23, 2003 in Plymouth. From the outside, they were a young, educated, well-matched couple building a life together. Rachel worked as a teacher of English, drama and theatre studies at a Catholic high school in Redditch, Worcestershire. Neil worked in information technology. In April 2005, their daughter, Lillian Rose, was born. The baby, quickly nicknamed Lily Bean by her family, became the centerpiece of a life that appeared genuinely happy. Photos flooded the family's website. Rachel's parents in Massachusetts, Joseph and Priscilla Matarazzo, doted on her from across the Atlantic. Sometime in 2005, the family decided to move to the United States so that Rachel and Lillian could be closer to her family. They flew to Massachusetts, stayed initially with the Matarazzos in Carver, and then began searching for their own place. In the first week of January 2006, they signed a 3-month lease on a 4-bedroom colonial-style house at 6 Cubs Path in Hopkinton, a quiet suburb roughly 26 miles west of Boston. The monthly rent was $2,700. They had lived there for 10 days when Rachel and Lillian were killed. What Rachel and her family did not know was that the life Neil had presented to them was largely fabricated. He had not worked since September 2005. He had told his in-laws he was earning $10,000 a month from an offshore account set up by a former employer in England. No such account existed. In reality, he had accumulated more than $30,000 in credit card debt. Much of it had been run up furnishing the Hopkinton house, and sustaining an image of financial stability he could not afford.
He had operated a series of internet businesses, schemes that promised to make buyers wealthy through adult internet ventures, that had earned him multiple fraud complaints. In January 2006, the same month he moved his family into their new home, eBay banned him from the platform over fraudulent transactions. His website, which offered to help clients earn £1 million in under 2 years through online pornography businesses for a joining fee of £50, was shut down within days of the murders. On January 16, 2006, 4 days before the killings, someone using a laptop computer recovered from the Entwistle home searched Google for the phrase "how to kill with a knife" and visited several websites offering local escort services in the Hopkinton area. On the afternoon of January 17th, that same laptop, under the user profile ENT, which required a password only Neil used, was used to search for "knife in neck kill" and "quick suicide method." The search history also showed visits to a website called Adult Friend Finder, where Entwistle had sent messages to women saying he was looking for a discreet relationship with someone good in bed. He had also emailed women through another site, describing himself as looking for more fun in the bedroom. Rachel was home with their baby daughter. She knew nothing about any of this. On the morning of Friday, January 20th, 2006, at some point after 9 a.m, Neil Entwistle took a .22 caliber Colt Diamondback revolver that belonged to Joseph Matarazzo, his stepfather-in-law, from the Matarazzo home in Carver. Matarazzo had taken Neil target shooting at his sportsman's club on 2 separate occasions, where Neil had been taught how to load and handle the weapon. The keys to the trigger locks were kept on the kitchen counter. That morning, Neil Entwistle used that gun to shoot Rachel in the forehead at close range while she lay in the master bedroom. Lillian, 9 months old, was lying beside her mother. He shot her too. The bullet entered Lillian's torso and passed through her body, coming to rest above Rachel's left breast. He then pulled a duvet over both of them, tucking it around their bodies so they were almost entirely hidden beneath the bedding. He drove back to Carver and returned the revolver to the Matarazzo home before anyone was there to see him. He then drove back to Hopkinton and did not call police, did not call Rachel's mother, and did not call anyone. In the phone call he later gave to Massachusetts State Trooper Robert Manning from England, Neil said he had left home around 9 a.m. to run an errand and returned around 11 a.m. to find Rachel and Lillian dead. He said he pulled back the comforter, saw that his wife was pale, saw blood on the baby, and understood they had been shot. He said he was so overwhelmed that he decided to kill himself. He picked up a knife, but said he could not go through with it. He then drove to the Matarazzo home to retrieve a gun, but found the house locked and could not get inside. With no other option he could think of, he decided to fly to England to see his parents. He did not call 911. He did not call Rachel's mother. He did not call the family doctor or a neighbour or anyone with the ability to help. At approximately 5 a.m. on Saturday, January 21st, he purchased a one-way ticket on British Airways and boarded an 8:15 a.m. flight to London. By the time the sun came up that morning, he was already in the air over the Atlantic, leaving his wife and daughter covered under a blanket in an upstairs bedroom. That same Saturday evening, Rachel's mother Priscilla called the Hopkinton Police Department after she had arrived at the house as planned for a Saturday lunch, found no one home, left a note, and was still unable to reach Rachel by phone hours later. Friends had also shown up for a scheduled dinner party that night and found no one answering the door. 2 of them stayed in their cars overnight in the driveway. Police responded that Saturday night and conducted a check of the house. They did not find the bodies. The bedding had concealed them completely, and the officers conducting the welfare check left without investigating the bedroom thoroughly. On Sunday, January 22nd, Priscilla Matarazzo returned to the police station with her husband and Rachel's friends and filed a formal missing persons report. Officers returned to the house that afternoon. This time, they noticed an odour. They followed it to the master bedroom, moved the bedding, and found Rachel and Lillian. They were lying together with their arms intertwined. The medical examiner's findings were that Rachel had been shot once in the forehead and Lillian once in the torso. The bullets were so small, fired from the .22 revolver, that the entry wound in Rachel's head
had gone completely undetected during the initial welfare check. Lillian's wound had only become visible after her mother's body was moved. Police immediately began looking for Neil. On January 23rd, a Massachusetts state trooper named Robert Manning called him at his parents' house in Worksop, England. Neil answered the phone and spoke for roughly 2 hours, telling Manning the story of finding the bodies and being too distraught to call anyone. When he described his attempt to retrieve a gun from the Matarazzo home to kill himself, investigators contacted Matarazzo, who confirmed he owned a .22 revolver and had taught Neil to use it. Forensic testing of the revolver found at the Matarazzo home matched it to the bullets recovered from Rachel and Lillian. Neil Entwistle's DNA was on the weapon. Rachel Entwistle's DNA was found on the muzzle. Police named Neil as a person of interest and issued an international arrest warrant. On February 1, 2006, Rachel and Lillian were buried together in a single coffin at Evergreen Cemetery in Kingston, Massachusetts. Their graves were marked with the surname Souza, Rachel's family name.
Lillian's birth and death certificates were later amended to read Father Unknown. More than 500 people attended the funeral. Neil Entwistle was not there. He was at his parents' house in Worksop, England, occasionally seen in the driveway by reporters. When he was arrested on February 8, 2006 by the Metropolitan Police Extradition Unit at Royal Oak Underground Station in London, he was carrying 3 things: a handwritten eulogy for Rachel, a draft letter in which he posed as a close friend to pitch the exclusive rights to his story to the highest media bidder, and a newspaper cutting with contact numbers for escort services. He waived extradition and was returned to Massachusetts on February 15th. His trial began in June 2008, 2.5 years after the murders. The defense argued that Rachel had suffered from postpartum depression and had shot Lillian and then herself. Prosecutors pointed out that the wounds were not consistent with self-infliction, that the gun had been returned to the Matarazzo home 50 miles away, and that a woman could not drive herself 50 miles after shooting herself in the forehead. The jury deliberated for less than 12 hours. On June 25, 2008, they returned a verdict of guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Neil Entwistle sat at the defense table, closed his eyes, and shook his head as the verdict was read. He showed no visible reaction at sentencing. He received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He is currently incarcerated at Old Colony Correctional Center in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case shares several elements with this one. A husband who reported concern for his missing wife, who cooperated with police, while simultaneously doing things that revealed exactly what had happened. But what sets the next case apart is the sheer volume and brazenness of the digital evidence left behind, including Google searches made from his own son's iPad while investigators were still in the early stages of the missing persons case. Case 9. Brian Walshe. Anna Lubicic was born in Belgrade, Serbia, and emigrated to the United States in 2005. She built her career from the ground up, starting as a housekeeper and server at the inn at Little Washington in Virginia, working her way up through hotel management, and eventually landing what prosecutors at her husband's trial would later call her dream job, a position as a regional general manager at the prestigious real estate firm Tishman Speyer, based in Washington, D.C. She was sharp, driven, and by any outward measure, successful. She and Brian Walshe married in 2016 and settled in Cohasset, Massachusetts, an affluent coastal town about 25 miles south of Boston. They had 3 sons together, aged 2, 4, and 6 at the time of her death. By the time Anna disappeared on New Year's Day 2023, she was 39 years old, splitting her time between the family's rented home in Cohasset and a townhouse she had purchased in Washington, D.C., which she had furnished in the hope the whole family would eventually join her there. That plan had been complicated by Brian. He was not who he presented himself to be. In 2021, he pleaded guilty in federal court to 3 counts of fraud: wire fraud, interstate transportation for a scheme to defraud, and an unlawful monetary transaction, connected to a years-long art fraud scheme involving counterfeit Andy Warhol paintings. The scheme had started around 2011,
when Brian took 2 original Warhol shadow paintings from a friend in South Korea under the pretense of selling them on his behalf. He instead sold the originals to a US gallery.
He then acquired replicas and attempted to sell those too. First to a buyer in France in 2015, then on eBay in 2016, where a California art gallery owner paid $80,000 and immediately spotted them as fakes. By the time Anna disappeared, Brian had pleaded guilty but had not yet been sentenced, and his sentencing had been delayed repeatedly. He was living under federal house arrest in Cohasset. He could not leave Massachusetts. This meant Anna was making the Washington commute alone every week, leaving the children in Brian's care, a fact prosecutors argued he leveraged to avoid prison by positioning himself as the primary caregiver. The marriage was in serious trouble. Anna had told friends she was considering leaving Brian. She feared he would eventually go to prison for the art fraud. Court documents show that in late December 2022, Anna told a friend she intended to relocate her 3 children to Washington and was prepared to leave Brian entirely. On December 26, Brian's mother, acting on Brian's direction according to prosecutors, hired a Washington, D.C.-based private investigator to conduct surveillance on Anna at her workplace because Brian believed she was having an affair. He was right. Prosecutors later called a man to testify who confirmed he and Anna had been involved romantically. Between Christmas and New Year's, searches were conducted on Brian's devices for best divorce strategies for men and Washington, D.C. divorce lawyers. On the iPad belonging to one of his sons, there were searches for Anna Walshe found dead, dated December 25, 2022, a full week before she was killed. On the evening of December 31, 2022, Brian and Anna hosted a New Year's Eve dinner at their Cohasset home with one family friend, Jem Mutlu, who later testified there had been no indication of any impending problem and that the topic of a work emergency in Washington never came up. Mutlu left the house around 1:30 in the morning of January 1st. Anna was last confirmed to be alive in the early hours of that same morning, around 4 a.m, when cell phone data placed her device in the Cohasset home. At some point on January 1st, 2023, Brian Walshe killed Anna. Prosecutors argued he killed her in their basement. He then began the work of covering it. At approximately 5:07 p.m. on January 1st, cell phone data placed him in Swampscott, near his mother's apartment complex, where surveillance cameras recorded what appeared to be Brian exiting a vehicle and throwing a trash bag into a dumpster. At 5:41 p.m, he arrived at a Lowe's store in Danvers. Security footage showed him moving through the store, wearing a black face mask and blue rubber gloves, filling a cart. He paid $463.26 in cash. The receipt showed a hacksaw, utility knife, hammer, wire snips, a Tyvek disposable full bodysuit, shoe guards, rags, cleaning supplies, and buckets. Over the following 2 days, he continued shopping at CVS, Stop & Shop, Home Depot, TJ Maxx, Walgreens, and another Lowe's, purchasing hydrogen peroxide, ammonium, baking soda, scented candles, a mop, and replacement rugs. On January 2nd, he also sent text messages to Anna's phone, knowing she would never see them, saying hello, asking where she was, saying he was worried, and that he was calling her contacts to find her. All of this was happening while his wife's family and colleagues had heard nothing from her. On January 4th, 2023, Tishman Speyer contacted Cohasset police to report Anna missing after she failed to appear for work. On the same day, Brian Walshe also reported her missing. When police arrived at the Cohasset home, they found Brian there with his 3 young children. The family was eating McDonald's. Brian was calm. He told police that Anna had left their home early on January 1st for a work emergency, taking a Lyft or Uber to Logan Airport to catch a flight to Washington. He told the same story in 4 separate interviews with Cohasset Police and Massachusetts State Police over the following days. There was no record of Anna taking any rideshare from their home. There was no record of her boarding any flight. Her phone's last active data point placed it in the Cohasset area in the early hours of January 2nd, not at an airport. Her employer told investigators there had been no emergency. On January 8th, investigators arrested Brian on a charge of misleading a police investigation after establishing he had lied about his whereabouts on January 1st, telling police he had visited a CVS and Whole Foods in Swampscott when surveillance confirmed he had not.
A search warrant executed on the Cohasset home found blood and a damaged, blood-stained knife in the basement. Within days, investigators tracing the route of his cell phone movements searched multiple dumpsters in the region, including one across from his mother's apartment complex in Swampscott. In a dumpster there, they found trash bags containing Anna's hunter boots, a black Prada purse, a short black coat, her Hermes watch, a piece of her Gucci necklace, her COVID-19 vaccination card, blood-stained rugs that matched the dimensions of rooms in the Cohasset house, a Tyvek suit matching the one purchased at Lowe's, a hammer, shears, a hatchet, and a hacksaw. DNA testing linked blood on multiple items to Anna Walshe. The hacksaw had a bone fragment in it. On January 18, 2023, Brian Walshe was charged with first-degree murder and the illegal disposal of human remains. His son's iPad, when examined by digital forensic investigators, contained searches conducted in the days immediately after the murder, including how long before a body starts to smell, dismemberment, and the best ways to dispose of a body. Hacksaw, best tool to dismember. Can you be charged with murder without a body? How to clean blood from wooden floor. 10 ways to dispose of a dead body if you really need to, and can you use bleach to clean blood from wood floors? The same device also showed the December 25th searches for Anna Walshe found dead, made 8 days before he killed her. Anna's body was never recovered. Her remains have never been found. The trial began on December 1st, 2025, nearly 3 years after her death. Just before jury selection started on November 18th, Brian pleaded guilty to the 2 lesser charges, misleading a police investigation and improper conveyance of a human body, while maintaining his innocence on the murder count. The defence argued Anna had died suddenly of unexplained causes, and that Brian, panicking, had disposed of her body rather than calling authorities. The defence called no witnesses. Brian did not testify. Prosecutors called 48 witnesses over 2 weeks, and built their case entirely on digital evidence, surveillance footage, forensic DNA, and the physical items recovered from the dumpsters. On December 15, 2025, the jury of 6 men and 6 women deliberated for approximately 6 hours over 2 days before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. It was the first conviction for first-degree murder in Norfolk County without a body that the district attorney could recall. Brian Walshe showed no visible reaction as the verdict was read. On December 17, 2025, Judge Diane sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with no less than 19 additional years for lying to police, and no less than 2 years for the improper disposal of Anna's body. The 3 Walshe children were placed into state custody. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case in this list involves a man whose cooperation with investigators was not a cover story told to police in the days after a murder. It was a formal agreement made in a courtroom years after his arrest, in which he agreed to lead investigators to the buried remains of his victims as part of a negotiated deal to avoid execution, driving law enforcement to locations across the Pacific Northwest that had gone undiscovered for decades. Case 10. Gary Ridgway. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons. His family moved to the SeaTac area of Washington state when he was a child, and he grew up in a neighborhood along Pacific Highway South, the same stretch of road where, decades later, he would pick up most of his victims. His father drove a bus. His mother was a sales clerk. By his own account to defense psychologists, he had a troubled relationship with his mother, who he described as controlling and sexually inappropriate. He wet the bed into his early teens. In the mid-1960s, he stabbed a 6-year-old boy in the woods. He later told investigators he was curious to see what it would feel like to kill someone. The child survived. No charges were filed. Ridgway graduated from high school in 1969 at age 20. He had repeated a grade and served 2 years in the United States Navy. He returned to the Seattle area, found work as a spray painter at the Kenworth Truck Company in Renton, Washington, and spent the next 3 decades painting trucks while living an entirely ordinary, visible life. He married 3 times. He had a son. He attended church regularly with his third wife. Neighbours described him as quiet, unremarkable, the kind of man no one noticed. He worked the same job for 30 years without incident. While he was there, painting trucks in a factory, he was also killing women across King County, dumping their bodies in wooded areas and along roadsides, and returning to those sites to have sex with the decomposing corpses. His first known victims appeared in July 1982, when two teenagers found the body of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield floating in the Green River between Kent and Tukwila. Over the following weeks, 4 more bodies were found in or near the same river, all women, all strangled. By August 1982, King County Police recognised they were dealing with a serial killer and eventually formed a dedicated task force. Ridgway became a suspect in 1983 when 18-year-old Marie Malvar disappeared, and her boyfriend reported seeing her get into a truck matching Ridgway's. Detectives questioned him. He denied any involvement. In 1984, he voluntarily agreed to take a polygraph test, denied killing anyone, and passed. He was released. Investigators maintained surveillance on him for 2 weeks in 1986 and found nothing actionable. In April 1987, police executed a search warrant on his home and vehicles and collected a saliva sample from him before leaving. The DNA technology available at the time could not match the sample to biological evidence recovered from the victims. Ridgway was not arrested. He went home and kept killing. He would later tell investigators that he murdered most of his victims in his own house, in his truck, or in secluded outdoor areas. His method was nearly always the same. He picked women up along Pacific Highway South, usually near the airport. He showed them a photograph of his son to make them feel safe. After sex, he strangled them with his arm or a ligature. He then dumped the bodies in forested and overgrown areas in clusters around South King County, near the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, and in river gorges. He sometimes transported victims' remains into Oregon to confuse investigators about the geographic range of the killer. He planted false evidence, cigarette butts, gum wrappers, near the bodies to suggest other suspects. When victims scratched him during their struggles, he clipped off their fingernails before dumping them. After his 1983 interrogation about Marie Malvar, he admitted years later that he had stood against a fence throughout the entire interview to hide the scratches Malvar had left on his arm while fighting for her life. He then burned the scratches with battery acid after the detectives left. By the time police got a usable DNA match in 2001, Ridgway had been murdering women for nearly 2 decades. Advances in forensic technology allowed investigators at the King County Sheriff's Office to re-examine the 1987 saliva sample and compare it to biological material recovered from victims. The match was conclusive. On November 30th, 2001, detectives arrived at the Kenworth factory in Renton as Ridgway was finishing his shift and arrested him as he walked out of the building. He was charged with 4 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Those charges carried the possibility of the death penalty. What followed was one of the most significant plea agreements in the history of American criminal law. In June 2003, King County prosecutor Norm Maleng agreed to take the death penalty off the table in exchange for Ridgway's complete and truthful cooperation, meaning not just a guilty plea, but a sustained commitment to lead investigators to his victims' buried and scattered remains, to provide specific details about each killing, and to answer all questions asked by detectives and prosecutors. The deal required Ridgway to plead guilty to every murder in King County that could be corroborated by reliable evidence, including any future cases. For the families of dozens of missing women, some of whom had spent years believing their daughters might still be alive, it was the only mechanism through which they might ever learn what had happened. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in a King County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. In the statement he read in court, he said he killed so many women that he had a hard time keeping them straight. He said he had killed them because he hated them and did not want to pay for sex. He said he had thought of killing prostitutes as his career. The families of victims sat in the gallery. Some spoke in court about what he had taken from them. On December 18, 2003, Judge Richard Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. As part of his cooperation, Ridgway led investigators to multiple undiscovered remains. He took detectives to a site near Enumclaw, Washington, where the remains of 16-year-old Pammy Annette Avent were found in August 2003. In September 2003, the remains of Marie Malvar, the woman whose disappearance in 1983 first put detectives on his trail, were found. April Buttram's remains were also located that month. Ridgway led investigators to 4 bodies in the months following his plea. In November 2005, hikers found a skull in wooded land near Highway 18 east of Seattle that belonged to Tracy Winston, who had been 19 years old when she vanished from a shopping mall in 1983. The discovery triggered Ridgway's 49th life sentence under the terms of his plea agreement. In February 2011, he entered a formal guilty plea for the 1982 murder of 20-year-old Rebecca Marrero, whose skull had been found by hikers in Auburn in December 2010. He received his 49th consecutive life sentence. Identification of victims continued long after sentencing through advances in forensic genetic genealogy and DNA technology. In December 2023, remains found in 1985 and held in storage for nearly 4 decades were identified through DNA as belonging to 15-year-old Lori Ann Raspotnik, who had run away from home in 1982. In January 2024, remains designated only as Bones 20 in investigators' files were identified as belonging to Everett teenager Tammy Lyles, whose bones had been found in South King County after Ridgway led investigators to the general area in 2003. The cooperation did not end with his sentencing. Under the terms of the plea agreement, Ridgway was required to continue meeting with King County Sheriff's detectives whenever requested to provide information on open homicide cases. Those meetings happened routinely over the following 2 decades. In September 2024, Ridgway was 75 years old and in declining health when he told detectives during one of those regular sessions that he believed he could physically locate additional burial sites that verbal descriptions alone had failed to pinpoint. Previous attempts based on directions he had given from prison had not produced results. The King County Sheriff's Office organised a multi-day operation. On September 9, 2024, Ridgway was transferred from the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla to the King County Jail under seal, meaning the transport order was classified so the public and media would not learn about it in advance. Detectives took him out of the jail on multiple occasions between September 9th and 13th and drove him to locations across King County where he claimed to have left remains. Cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar were used at each site. The transport order was unsealed in March 2025 after court documents were released. Authorities confirmed the trips had taken place. When asked whether any remains had been found, the King County Sheriff's spokesperson declined to comment because the cases involved remained open. Ridgway has claimed in interviews that his true victim count is somewhere between 75 and 85. The official confirmed total is 49. Investigators believe the real number is higher than 49 and lower than his claimed maximums, but no number beyond 49 has been corroborated. He remains at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla, serving 49 consecutive life sentences. He is 76 years old. He will die there. Every case in this list shares one central quality: a killer who understood exactly what the search for his victims looked like from the outside and inserted himself into that picture deliberately. Some did it to deflect suspicion. Some did it to appear grief-stricken. Some did it to feel the thrill of standing over what they had done while the world watched. And one, at the very end of this list, did it in the most calculated way of all, by negotiating the terms of his own cooperation in a courtroom, then spending the next 2 decades deciding, on his own schedule, what he was willing to reveal and what he would take with him to the grave. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.